Welcome back to another episode of Activista Rise Up. I am Dr. Patricia Campos-Medina, your host. You can listen to this podcast or this webcast on all my social media platforms or Spotify or Apple Podcasts. I am so excited to continue these conversations with amazing leaders doing the work of leading social movements or just trying to do the right thing for our communities. Today, we're going to meet an amazing leader, a community leader in housing policy advocate that I have come to know from our progressive movement building efforts here in New Jersey. Her name is Staci Berger, and we will learn from her what it will take to actually create real, affordable housing in New Jersey so that we can combat the housing crisis that we are facing right now across this country. So welcome, Staci, to Activista Rise Up.
Thank you so much for having me, Patricia. It's really an honor and a pleasure. I've watched and listened to some of the podcasts before, and you know, they're wonderful, amazing stories. And I'm really just honored to be able to be with you and to have your friendship in this struggle for justice.
The honor is mine. I mean, I follow all the work that you do on so many progressive issues, but specifically on an issue that sounds so intractable, which is affordable housing. You're sort of like the to-go person on that issue. But you do progressive work across many causes, and I'll be honest to say, we ran paths together, working to try to move the Me Too movement forward in New Jersey when we were both supporting Bernie, for president. So, but I think that just was a culmination of all the work that you do, because you do exciting work around progressive causes, in New Jersey. So I want to start there. Like, what got you into movement building, into working and organizing for social justice? Tell me a little bit about yourself and your story.
Well, this is just who I am and kind of what I've always done. I went to my first peace march when I was 5, and so that's the kind of family I grew up in. We were
back when we had peace marches, right? Because we don't have peace marches right now.
Well, I grew up outside of Boston, and there were a couple of very large ones. My mom raised us to never cross a picket line, never buy on a boycott, and that's just the kind of family I grew up in and the kind of values that I was taught as a child. I came to New Jersey to go to Rutgers. For folks who are out of state, Rutgers is held up, or at least it was many years ago, as an almost private school. And I got very deeply involved in fighting for lower tuition and student votes on the Board of Governors. I was involved in direct action and civil disobedience. I got an extra semester with a number of my co-student leaders when we took over Bishop House in 1992 in the fight to freeze tuition and get those student votes on the Board of Governors. And so a bunch of us were arrested by mail, which is really disempowering. Smart on the administration's part, but we spent a whole series of some years actually organizing around tuition and making college affordable for working class and low income families. And as a Livingston College student, it was really part of the whole fabric of that college before it became completely centralized in the university. It was really an activist school. It was where people, especially in the labor studies department and political science department, went to study and do research. It is very different as a campus than it was when I went there almost 30 years ago. I still live like 5 minutes from there, so I feel like Central New Jersey is my home away from home. And I've just really always been part of a movement for social and political and economic and racial justice.
I tell students all the time, when they ask me, how can we support, progressive cause? And I said, you are at the heart of building movement. You're a student, you're in a college campus, you speak a cause, right?
Right. I was invited by Rutgers, the Are You Progressive chapter, Our Revolution Rutgers, to talk with the students there just a couple weeks ago. And it was so heartwarming to be back on campus and to see the great work that young people are doing here and around the country. They really are leading the way, and they are the future of social justice and political movements, and also literally the future. And I think a lot of us who are in our 50s
Yeah, each
You know,
generation.
we owe a lot to them to keep, you know, we owe them because they continue to inspire and lead, even though the circumstances are so different from what we went through.
Each generation, I think, have a responsibility to pick up the baton and continue the fight for social justice. That's what I began this podcast on leaders and leadership, and what does it take to actually continue a movement and move a movement forward. Because I think that we all need to learn from the lessons of the past, but also get inspired by what young people and the new movements are doing to figure out like how do we keep moving the needle forward. So I agree with you. As students have a role to play, and during this pandemic, it was also the young people, that were doing all the marches that gave energy to a lot of our work. So I'm excited. So you told me a little bit about how you got started as a student activist at Rutgers, and obviously that commitment to organizing and social justice has carried you over through your professional life. So you have tell me a little bit about your what you're doing right now in your official capacity, and also I read a tidbit that you are in the advisory board of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. So that was tell me how that connects to your housing work.
Sure. So yeah, I've been the President and CEO here at the Housing and Community Development Network, which is the statewide association of nonprofit community organizations fighting to be sure everyone has a safe, affordable place to call home in a great community for almost 9 years. It'll be 9 years this month, actually. And before that, I was the director of advocacy. And prior to that, I worked at New Jersey Citizen Action as the political director there, the state's largest consumer watchdog organization. I did a short stint as a labor organizer with HPA, the Health Professionals and Allied Employees. We organized the American Red Cross, which was no small feat to organize. They were really, they were not at the level of Amazon in terms of union busting, but they were pretty bad. Shout out to the Amazon workers in Staten Island. We're recording today, so right, that's unbelievable, just amazing. So excited for all of them. And I did a AFL-CIO Organizing Institute program, which was really young and nascent at the time. They had just sort of launched a new program to recruit new organizers into the labor movement. And so I actually got shipped to Lansing, Michigan, dropped in to a organizing drive, a card check campaign that I wasn't even old enough to rent a car. They had to lend me the organizing director's car. And I drove around Bath, Michigan with no cell phone. We didn't have cell phones.
Experience for organizing.
It was one of the greatest experiences of my life. Of that campaign, we did not succeed, but HPAE did. And the folks at the American Red Cross blood drives really was a seminal part of my professional development. Really seeing people stand up for themselves in a way that was really risky and also innovative. They had moved all the workers around every day. They really broke up their blood drive shifts, and so we didn't know when people were going to see each other. And this was pre-internet, really. People didn't have cell phones. We couldn't communicate by email in any meaningful way. So we gave everyone like disposable cameras, like the kind you used to give out at a wedding. And we had them take pictures of each other on site. And then we put together a big poster and we mailed it to everybody. And that said, I'm voting yes. And it's still in my office at work. It's it's moved with me to every office I've ever been to because it's just sort of part of what I am. But yeah, I am also on the Presidential Advisory Committee of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, which seems like perhaps an odd juxtaposition of the rest of my work.
Yes.
But you know the saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, right?
Exactly.
So when you're invited to serve, in my professional capacity, I'm often able to interact with banks and lending institutions to make them do the right thing and hold them accountable to the communities and residents that they are responsible to. So in the last 50 years, the country has really tried to implement the Community Reinvestment Act, which is the seminal piece of one of the seminal pieces of legislation from the 60s and 70s that has helped residents, lower income residents and communities of color access capital. Basically, banks that take deposits are supposed to make loans. They didn't, right? In the 50s and the 60s, they redlined and they discriminated against people, and they still do. And we know that, especially in the appraisal market, that's really a problem.
Yeah.
But just in general, there are still, if it's not, it's not de jure, it's de facto, right? So we are trying really hard to make sure that banks, and there are lots of banks that do want to do that business. They want to lend, and they want to be, writing those mortgages. And then there are others that are not great actors. And so we try to encourage people to be on the right side of history and do the right thing, by either getting them to sign a Community Reinvestment Act agreement and committing resources. I will say there are some great banks in New Jersey that have done that. PNC has a huge commitment. TD Bank, M&T. There are quite a few large lending institutions, and then the Federal Reserve of Philadelphia is really an opportunity to listen to financial institution experts, people that I don't have that level of access to information really anywhere else. What are people thinking about in terms of financial markets? What are big corporations thinking about in terms of workforce development 20, 30 years from now? It's really fascinating. And I always, when I get to go, and when I used to get to go in person, I really just feel like it's an opportunity to listen and learn. And I'm always open to doing that, and hearing what's happening in other parts of the sector and the marketplace.
It's important to talk about that because we often think that those of us who are demanding social justice and social investment are do not understand that what investment looks like or what financial
Right.
markets look like. The only that we oppose financial investments, but what I think we understand when they don't work, for people.
Right.
And when they don't
Right.
work for people is when we get policies that create like what you deal with every day, like the lack of affordable housing or the lack of investment in communities that allows for people to work and live in the same communities. So I wanted to talk to you about the Federal Reserve because I do think financial institutions do play a critical role of who they lend to and
That's
where
right.
to invest money, right?
That's right.
And
Right.
that gets to the soul, and you raise it, and a lot of people don't understand what redlining means. Can you explain a little bit about what redlining is and how it has led to this disparity in housing opportunities for low-wage working families, not just communities of color, but just working families who can afford some of the home housing that has been built without any regulations? So, what is redlining?
So redlining is actually a very specific term that goes back to the 20s, 30s, and all the way through the 60s, where banks actually did take out a big map and draw a red line around areas they would not lend to. And those areas were primarily people of color and low-income workers. And they just would not lend to those people. And there was no regulation and no law requiring them to do it, so they didn't. And that really is one of the many things. There's 400 years of history in setting up our discriminatory housing market. And I will just say anyone who's really interested in learning that history should check out everything and anything written by the good folks at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, because they have done tremendous research on this. And we're lucky to have them doing that work and fighting to make sure that there's housing wealth equity in our housing market. But that term redlining really comes from taking that map and drawing a red line around where the banks would not lend.
And that has had it has an effect on creating segregated neighborhoods even
That's
today.
right.
Yeah.
Right. It has an effect on segregation in the neighborhood, which has an effect on segregation in our schools. And it has a tremendous effect on the accumulation of generational wealth, because if you're able to purchase a home and then send your kids to college with the equity that's in your home, and then sell that home and buy a smaller home, but continue to build that generational wealth family, generation after generation in a family, that's something that is, it would just take it would take thousands of years for people to catch up, for Black and brown people to catch up.
Yeah. I mean, just there's so many families, first generation immigrants that I know, that their only wealth after they stop working is their home or the value of their home. And that it's a pride, it gives them pride to have a home, but that's the only wealth. And that means that their kids are a little better off than they were, because there's something to move to pass to your family. So I totally understand that. So how did we get to in New Jersey? I was reading recently that we do have a crisis of housing. Well, it's not just New Jersey, but in the country we have a housing crisis. But in New Jersey, recently I read that during the last 2 years, we have the number of people who have lost their homes has increased, and that we have low levels of affordable housing. So what is the crisis in New Jersey right now with affordable housing, and what can we do about it?
So we can do a lot of stuff about it. I'll start with that and say that I am optimistic that we can make sure that everyone has a safe, affordable place to call home. It's really a question of political will. We know how to do it. We have the resources. We need the federal and state government to invest in our communities and in the development of homes that people can afford. Nowhere in the entire United States do we have a county in which a family that's working at minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So New Jersey is not alone.
Yeah.
Every year, our national organization, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, puts out a report called Out of Reach. And almost every year, New Jersey is at the top 5 or 6 slot for the least affordable place to rent. We led the nation for a long time, and sometimes still do, in the foreclosure crisis, which disproportionately impacted Black and Brown homeowners. I attribute our leadership in that debacle directly to Chris Christie and the really the utter lack of leadership that he and his administration showed in addressing the foreclosure crisis. There were lots of things that they could have done with federal funding, and he just took every penny that wasn't nailed down and some pennies that were to backfill the budget so that his billionaire friends didn't have to pay more in taxes. And so it set us up in a really difficult way, and not in a good way, for the pandemic, when people, lost their jobs and or weren't able to go to work because it wasn't safe. People were not able to pay their mortgage. Now, we did have a foreclosure and eviction moratorium that basically was, as far as I can tell, the best in the country.
Yeah.
And I give credit where credit is due to Governor Murphy. He and his team and Lieutenant Governor Oliver centered keeping people safely and stably housed during the pandemic as a key part of our pandemic response. And literally people's lives were saved. I mean, hundreds of thousands of evictions here and around the country, maybe even more than that, did not happen during the pandemic because of the moratoria and the rental assistance that was dispersed. And the Lieutenant Governor's team at the Department of Community Affairs has just been outstanding in terms of getting that funding out to people. It's gone to the people who were most harmed by the pandemic. The numbers are tremendous in terms of their response and the disbursement of those funds. Everything starts off a little bumpy when you're ramping up a multi-million-dollar program, but they've really done a great job. So the foreclosure crisis continues, though, and it's really a question of how are we helping homeowners address that. The state is now has just, I think, last month launched the Homeownership Assistance Fund, which was a federal program to help people impacted by COVID. So folks can go to the New Jersey Housing Mortgage Finance Agency website and sign up for that. It's really geared towards lower income homeowners and even small landlords. So sometimes a lot of immigrant families and lower income folks will buy a 2-family home, and you live on the first floor and you rent the second floor to, your sister or somebody. Those folks are all eligible for that homeownership assistance fund and should take advantage of it.
Yeah, that's been what you are absolutely right. One of the most successful programs, the housing assistance program during this pandemic, because it has kept families in their home, which is the most important thing to do in the time of crisis. Yeah.
And I also just want to note that even if people couldn't get rental assistance, it is really imperative for people to know that they cannot be evicted for failure to pay rent during the public health emergency. So that's depending on your income, either from March 2020 to August 31 or March 2020 to December 31 of last year. People who were impacted by COVID just need to self-certify that they were unable to pay rent, and they cannot be evicted for not paying rent during that period.
Landlord, how do you self-certify?
You can go. It's literally a form that says I was impacted by COVID and I was unable to pay my rent for that period of time.
Oh, I remember Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver talking about that form that the community.
Yep, it's a form. People can go to our website, Housing Help NJ, .com or .org, and the links are right there. They can self-certify, and then if someone does get an eviction, they have that self-certification that will protect them and keep them and their family safely in their home. They can also find out if there's additional rental assistance. Some counties still have rental aid. The state has dispersed all of it, unless there's more that comes through the federal government. But having that emergency rental assistance goes a long way to making housing more affordable.
Yeah, we'll make sure.
But we need to make sure that landlords are not price gouging. And I think we've seen a lot of that, especially corporate landlords who may have gotten a paycheck protection loan on one hand and also got paid by rental assistance on the other, and then decided that they just didn't want to deal with anything and they were going to raise rent 20%, which they completely are allowed to do in almost every municipality.
Who is supervising that? Because, as advocates,
nobody. It's a totally unregulated market, Patricia. That's part of the problem, is that it's very unregulated, and it's really every renter and tenant family for themselves. And it's not unreasonable for rent to go up a small amount. You got to fix stuff. You got to, property taxes go up. But I've seen things from like 18 to 25%. I mean, that's just egregious. And it's profiteering at a time when people need the exact opposite. We need compassion. We need community. We need understanding. And so part of what we've seen in our network of nonprofit housing organizations is not that, because we don't have a profit-driven model, right? We have housing is a human right. Housing is a basic right. Everybody has the right to have safe shelter. And our members do that, and they do it without delivering profits for a shareholder board.
Yeah.
And that's a very different model than most of our landlords.
Yeah. So, housing is, it's a social justice issue because it's about keeping communities safe, families safe. It's where, like, if you don't have a stable or a safe home, how are you gonna have how are you gonna grow up and be able to go to school or be able to have a stable job? So it's such an essential component of our struggle for social mobility, or for social justice. So I'm totally with you. And
also mental health, like the moving kids around is very bad for their physical and emotional health. The average age of a homeless person in Mercer County is 7.
Oh, wow. Those are children.
With
a stable life. I want to go back to that because I was reading Calavia Robertson, that's a reporter for NJ.com, wrote a story about this family who lost their home in Elizabeth about 2 years ago during the hurricane. And they had been bouncing from city to city looking for affordable housing over 2 years. So, so there's a lack of affordable housing for people, for families. And how did we get there in New Jersey? And explain a little bit about the Laurel decision, and what does that mean, and how do we go about addressing the limitations of affordable housing for people to live where they want to live in their cities?
So that's a lot of questions. I'm not sure how much time we have, but I'm going to try to answer as many of them as I can. So New Jersey is the only state in the country that has a requirement for every municipality to make a good faith effort to allow for the creation of affordable homes in their boundary. They basically can't use zoning laws to keep people out. They cannot exclude people by saying we will not allow these kinds of developments to happen here. And it comes from a case in the township of Mount Laurel, where people there tried to build garden-style apartments, and the mayor told them if they couldn't afford to live in the housing that was already there, they should leave. And so they sued, along with support from the NAACP and from the folks at Fair Share Housing Center, which is the leading legal and advocacy organization that works on Mount Laurel issues, and they are the experts in this. That is something that first 2 rounds, what we call rounds of Mount Laurel housing, is when so communities can put together a plan and say to the state, this is how we're going to meet our obligation. We know we have to build or create or preserve X number of homes for people, and this is how we're going to do it. And from 1980 to 1989, that happened. From 1990 to 1999, that also happened. And housing was sort of keeping pace. In the early 2000s, the Christine Todd Whitman administration did not promulgate rules for what was called the third round. And there was a tremendous amount of litigation in the early part of the 2000s between builders and communities to try to get to a process everyone could agree to. During that time, housing advocates, including our organization, Fair Share, NAACP, and lots of other groups, made a change in the fair housing law. And that change said that the law no longer allowed wealthy communities to pay poor urban communities for a portion of their housing obligation. So those were called regional contribution agreements, which is a very technical term, but basically, for example, the city, municipality like Hopewell, and I'm just picking on them. I don't know if they did this or not, but they could pay the city of Trenton to take 50% of their housing obligation. Trenton didn't necessarily have enough money to actually build housing with it, but they could do some rehab. So they put roofs on, they could do other stuff, but they didn't create new homes with it because it wasn't enough money.
Yeah.
So it became this cycle where communities were getting some money, but they weren't creating homes, and other communities were getting rid of some money, but they also weren't creating homes. We suddenly had a market. This is where understanding how the market works becomes really important, right? There just weren't enough apartments, and there weren't enough starter homes or senior buildings for folks.
Yeah.
And so we got that outlawed. Former Assembly Speaker Joe Roberts called it blood money. He said we shouldn't have, essentially wealthy white communities paying off their housing obligation. The Mount Laurel decisions are considered in the United States to be second only to Brown versus the Board of Education in terms of anti-segregation civil rights legislation. They're seminal legislation and litigation that really has done a tremendous amount to try to integrate New Jersey's communities and as a corollary our schools, right? So in 2008, that law changed and we were all ready to go and everybody was prepared to start building. And then Chris Christie got elected. And one of his first executive orders was to gut the Council on Affordable Housing, which was the agency that oversaw all of that. Yeah. I'm giving you like 30 years of housing history in like 3 minutes.
Yeah,
it's a lot. So there was basically almost a decade of litigation around what Christie tried to do to the Council on Affordable Housing and how he tried to make it impossible for communities to build and be responsible for their fair share responsibility. And that sort of ended in 2015, 16, and then towns had a year or two to put together a plan. And that has started to happen. And so what Governor Murphy announced in his budget a few weeks ago, that $305 million that he's going to use from the federal COVID relief funds, from the ARP funds, the American Rescue Plan, to put that into those municipalities that had those plans ready to go in this round, that will jumpstart those developments. And we believe that that'll be like 3,000 new homes for people, primarily lower income renting families.
I know it's a lot of history, but I like hearing it, and I like our listeners to hear it and listen to it, because it shows how you have to keep on an issue. You have to keep mobilizing. You have to keep using the law and the lawsuits, because that's part of movement building, challenging the status quo. So I think it's important. Thank you for giving us so much history and elevating that elections do matter. Who is the governor? Who is the speaker of the assembly matters in how things get changed around. But the activism of people like you and people who filed the lawsuits and like the NAACP matter in making this issue. So if people want to go back to actually building affordable housing in their communities, and I just saw Mayor Ras Baraka announce a big creation of affordable housing in Newark, which is so welcome. What can people do to access perhaps the investment that the governor is putting on his budget this time around? Who can they call? Who is out there doing this work, and how they can access some of those funds?
So a couple of things. One, I was remiss, and I should note that in addition to the NAACP, Latino Action Network and Latino Action Network Foundation, as well as Supportive Housing Association and a whole host of disability organizations, all were involved in those lawsuits to make sure that everybody has a safe, affordable place to call home. And so it was really a lot of organizing and movement building to build those, strong coalitions to make sure that the legislature was watching what the judiciary was doing. It was really, pressure points in all places. Yeah. In order to get that funding from the governors, proposal to get signed on his desk on June 30th. Our budget in the state has to be signed by June 30. We need people to call their legislators and tell them that they want affordable housing. People call me all the time and ask if I can help them find affordable housing. And the only thing I really ask that they do in return, I'm always happy to help if I can, but is to call their elected officials and let their elected officials know that it's a problem. It's a problem in cities, it's a problem in suburbs, it's a problem in rural areas. We simply do not have enough homes that people can afford. And we can get to those by doing a bunch of things. We can rehab existing homes. We can buy down foreclosed properties. We can make sure that people who are being foreclosed on have first dibs on that property. At the Sheriff's Sale, Assemblywoman Timberlake has a great bill that just passed her committee that would give families and neighborhood organizations the ability to hold on to those properties so they don't go to speculators and hedge funds in California who don't necessarily care what happens to our neighborhoods in 5 or 10 years. So providing those kinds of resources to families and communities is really important. But legislators and local elected officials need to hear from people that making sure that folks can stay in their neighborhood and stay in their communities, because, while they're creating more affordable options, is really important. So getting more housing vouchers so people can write down the rent a little bit at the same time that we maybe get some common sense regulations around price gouging.
There's actions people can take at the state level. So call your state legislators, and we're going to put that information as to what the state can do. In the municipalities, though, mayors and city councils have a lot of power in creating.
They sure do.
Yes, creating affordable housing units. So explain how citizens can demand that power.
They can go to their people can go to your council meetings. You can go to your planning board meetings. You can go to your zoning board meetings. The agreements where municipalities lay out how they're going to meet their fair share housing responsibility, those are public documents, and there are hearings on those. And the third round will end in 2025. So the next round will start to be shaped now, right? And people will see, people can ask, when you see your mayor or your city council person at, a public event, they need to hear from people that you want them to create more options for affordable housing in your neighborhood.
And I always tell them, if you see if they're touting a local development, a complex, the first thing you should ask is what's the investment of that developer for affordable housing in your town?
Right. So some developments are 100% affordable.
Yeah.
But many are inclusionary, and so there's a few apartments that are set aside to be affordable, and the rest are market rate.
Yeah.
And maybe what we need to look at is what other states have, which is a certain threshold of those apartments has to be a certain number, percentage. Like in Massachusetts, 15% across the board. Still not enough, but it's a floor and not a ceiling.
So you think we're moving forward on making this argument that we do need to create affordable housing for people to live where they work and work where they live?
I think so. I mean, I think we're seeing it in Newark, right? Mayor Baraka sent out a whole list of ways that the city of Newark has made housing more affordable and is working to make it more affordable, from providing safe places for unhoused residents, people without permanent addresses, to take a shower, use the restroom, rest for a couple of days, and then plug folks into a social service and organization that can help them get the resources they need. We need to absolutely follow a housing first model, and that's where we make sure that everyone is safely housed first, and then worry and wonder about why they wound up homeless or why they are not safely housed. Other states do that. It's much less expensive to make sure someone has safe, affordable housing than it is to do anything else to provide those social services to, keeping people in motels is an emergency scenario, and nobody should be out in the elements. Nobody should be living in a tent. People are living in tents in the state of New Jersey in 2022. So, right, we have Jeff Bezos taking a rocket ship to space for kicks, and we have people living in tents. And so there is a huge disconnect between the wealth that our country and our communities should have access to and the resources that working families and people struggling to make ends meet can access. Chris Christie did this horrible thing where he actually removed people's housing security by creating a program or creating a requirement in the housing programs that people had to plan for their own homelessness. If you couldn't demonstrate that you had planned for your own homelessness, I mean, I have a master's degree from Blaustein. Shout out to Rutgers, but like I haven't planned for my own homelessness. Who even does that? It's crazy.
Because you don't expect to be homeless.
Nobody expects to be homeless.
Yes.
No one does.
Yeah.
And so you layer on, bureaucracy on top of trauma. And
Yeah.
we need to walk that back in the other direction and make sure that people are safe and they're cared for and that they have a safe place to live and shower and use the restroom. And then we'll figure out how to get those wraparound social services. There are lots of great organizations, nonprofits, government agencies working really hard to make sure that people have access to those resources. We can do more if we have more funding. And I will say this is the first time in my lifetime that a presidential budget from President Biden and a state budget from Governor Murphy centered housing access, affordability, and security. The president's budget proposal, which came out earlier this week, has an enormous amount of funding for the creation of more affordable homes and also for housing stability and security. So I feel like we are at a moment where like 30 years of advocacy has started to pay off in a way that I can only hope is going to get across the finish line. I'm going to work. My colleagues are going to work. Everybody I know in the housing space is going to work our butts off to make sure that legislators at the state and federal level hear from people who need safe, affordable places to call home. And we're not going to give up because people's lives are on the line.
This whole putting those policies in their budget, both at the federal and state level, to me, is a demonstration of how you have to make policy people focused. You want to be able to invest in people, and if you have a policy focus on that, then your policies are different. I bet Chris Christie, the model that you explained to him is sort of putting the blame on the person rather than taking responsibility for the policies the government makes, to help people be successful in life. I mean, that's,
Right. We want everyone to be able to thrive, to send their kids to a good school, to be able to go to work, enjoy their job.
Housing is a public policy, it's a public good.
Right. Right. And right now, what we've had for the last 30 to 50 years, really since Reagan, since the federal government stepped out of investing in housing at all, and you can track the level of homelessness and housing insecurity directly to the Reagan administration. I mean, so many bad things, right?
So I know that. So you sounded very hopeful, and that things are changing. So if people want to get involved in the issue of continuing to make sure that things are changing, how can they get involved with your organization or with any other groups that are doing this work? So who can they go to get engaged in issues of affordable housing in New Jersey?
Well, if your listeners and viewers want to get involved, they can reach out to me. We have a group of nonprofit members and advocates that meet monthly or in different places around the state. We do briefings, we do legislative days, we do all kinds of direct advocacy, education, and outreach at the Housing and Community Development Network. So they're welcome to reach out to me, and I will plug them into maybe an organization that's close to them. Because we mostly function at the state level, but we're only as strong as our grassroots.
Of course, and a lot of decisions can also be dealt at like we talk about the mayor's level, at the city council level. There's a lot of power there to invest in affordable housing. So, but in order for that to happen, we need elected officials who understand that public policy and government is about creating good policy focusing on people. So, and I heard that you are running for office in your local town. And can you tell me a little bit of what led you to that decision to run for office? I see you as an advocate, as a movement builder, and sometimes we need more people like you to run for office. So
so you should run for office too. So Donald Trump getting no, see, that's the problem when people say never. We want good elected officials. We need to put ourselves out there and be willing to do what we want other people to do. And it really just comes down to that. I live in Piscataway. We are the 7th most diverse community in New Jersey. We have great neighbors. It's a really vibrant, dynamic township. We have a Democratic Party that still thinks it's like 1955 here, and they are really kind of they have hitched their economic development wagon almost exclusively to building warehouses in residential neighborhoods next to elementary schools. They are not really, involved in or supportive of organizing workers, providing community benefit agreements, doing any kind of residential set-asides, and it's really terrible for our air quality and quality of life. And people are just tired of it, and they want change. That's kind of the biggest reason. But also, after Donald Trump was elected, we went to our local Democratic Party officials and said, "What are you going to do?" Like every other town that was as blue on paper as Piscataway is in terms of voter registration, they were having marches, they were putting people on buses, they were holding rallies. Our elected officials did very nothing. I don't even want it. It's not even little. They did nothing. And so people were really, had an appetite here because our community is so democratic, both big D and little d. There was an appetite for building a grassroots community organization that could run people for office, organize those kinds of events, and be a place where people who care about the future of our community and want something better than essentially the machine politics we've had for 50 years to be in place. And people, it's been a really wonderful, almost reminiscent of student organizing in that it's completely grassroots where, we never have any funding. We are, totally shoestring and volunteer based, but it's all relational organizing. It's the folks you meet at the wrestling matches, or the people you're, through schools, or the folks who are in the other kinds of community civic organizations. So we have just a really great group of folks in our Progressive Democratic organization. It's a pleasure and honor to get to work with all of them. They make being part of a community really exciting and vibrant.
Well, I want to say that, so that I'm glad to see you running. I'm glad to see the energy that you and your team are putting together at the grassroots level, because I think that's the energy that we need, not just for the Democratic Party, but just to get our communities to change and to be able to have policies that are people focused and not power focused on people keeping their power for themselves. So I commend you for it. How can people support you or learn more about your campaign for office if they want to support you or support your grassroots efforts?
Sure. So they can go to my website for the campaign, which is staciforpway.com, STACI for FOR, Pway, PWAY.com. I will just say it was really interesting in the 2018 race. I ran in 2018. I came up about 150 votes short, and the local entirely Democratic council and Democratic organization used affordable housing against me. Wow. They photoshopped my picture from a PTO event and put it on a flyer that said Staci is a high-paid Trenton housing lobbyist trying to build housing, high-density housing in our neighborhoods, and she's, we've done our fair share and we don't need more housing. Which
that's like dog whistling there. That's like
it would be dog whistling if it were quieter. But it was shocking, I think, to a lot of Democrats in our community that people who say that they're Democrats would be against housing affordability for people in a community that is really a middle income working class community. And so I think that didn't sit well with a lot of folks. They made a fake Facebook page. I mean, they really went all out. They went full Trump. And did some really underhanded things. But I think we'll see what they're going to do this time.
Yeah.
Who knows? But we're just going to go out and talk to our neighbors about. I'm just going to go talk to my neighbors. I love canvassing. I've been I knocked doors since I was 18. So I'm going to go meet my neighbors.
Campaigns and talking to people and counteracting those nasty campaigns. I mean, like you mentioned. Warehouses, the building of warehouses is a big issue, and we just seen workers in warehouse, on themselves, a grassroots group.
That's right.
Voted and won an election against a giant global corporation like Amazon. So if we think about the ads there, I think you have great ads in Piscataway.
It's inspire. I mean, what the Amazon workers did at Amazon, is just inspiring, and
it will inspire more movements like that. To think that it's not impossible because the other guy looks like he has more money and more power. That we can still, when we're committed to the grassroots and the issues, that we can win. And I know I am so proud and excited because I see the energy that you put into the Bernie campaign, the Our Revolution campaign, and the Not Me Us effort to say that we don't do these things because it's about me, because it's about making our communities better. So I am always so excited to support you, and looking forward to being able to help you win this election and to just make sure that you
I'll take your help.
we need more people like you because we need
and more people like you.
yes.
I mean, we all have a role to play, and you're doing incredible work making sure that people's voices are heard and fighting for folks who were excluded from a lot of the pandemic recovery funds. And I just want to note that self-certification and the rental assistance, all of that is undocumented folks are eligible for all of that. So it's really important that people take advantage of what's available.
And we have a great coalition who supported the demand that undocumented workers were included. And I thank you for always being ready to step up and make sure that even in the rooms that we were not at, that you were always demanding that we needed to make sure undocumented workers or families had access to this program. So I want to thank you also for your solidarity and for inspiring the next generation. This is what Activista Rise Up is all about. It's about people hearing your story, your commitment to this work, getting connected to your work, and getting activated. So how can they stay connected with you and the work that you're doing, and how can people continue the fight forward? What gives you hope that people will do that?
This podcast gives me hope. The fact that I'm going to go meet some young people tomorrow, we're going to go do a little door knocking for the campaign. The fact that there are lots of people stepping into housing advocacy and policy work at the network. We're really fortunate to have a great team of Vistas, AmeriCorps Vistas, and community scholars in the summer. We have paid summer internships. We have a great opportunity for young folks to plug into the community development sector and learn what the work is like. And there's no real way to do that without doing it. So I draw energy and excitement from being around other people and being around people who are interested in teaching me, because I know that I don't know everything. So maybe someday someone will explain TikTok to me, because I really don't get it. But
my children taught me TikTok.
Yeah, I know. My children are teenagers, and they may or may not have the patience to teach their mom social media.
Yeah.
But they, being around other people who are committed to this work, are committed to social justice, and making our country and our communities places where everyone can thrive. And I feel like the thing that we all got from the Bernie campaign was that sense of solidarity and community. Was that some of those things may have sounded radical 20 years ago. Universal health care sounded radical, right? Medicare for all sounded radical. That's the other thing that the Piscataway
$15 an hour sounded radical. It's not.
$15 an hour sounded radical, right? But that's what people need. What people need and what people deserve.
Yeah,
exactly. To survive. If we want to live in a civil society where people have their basic needs met, and we are not relying on GoFundMe to help people meet their medical needs, like, we can do better. And I think that is and I think that's where I think that more people are starting to think that we can do better.
So thank you for all you do, Staci. Thank you for continuing the fight for fair housing. I totally agree with you. Fair housing is about justice, because it's about families and it's about our communities. So please get engaged. Contact the contact information for fair housing activities actions is going to be at the end of this podcast. Please take action. Housing is about people, for our families, for our community. Please join us. With all activists together, we can make change happen. This is Activista Rise Up. I'm Dr. Patricia Campos-Medina. Join us, take action. Sí se puede.